Good afternoon. My name is Tom Graham. I'm a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, and I want to welcome you all this evening to our discussion on Russia. The title of the program this evening is Crisis in Russia: How People Cope with Stress and How It's Reflected in Their Electoral Behavior. Now, we could actually have a conversation about the United States in that topic, but we're going to focus on Russia in part because they just had their Duma elections on the 18th of September. I dare say probably not quite as exciting as the election in the United States, but nevertheless, as well, I think we'll learn this evening, with some significance for what is happening political in Russia, what the future is. And it raises a lot of questions about the state of politics in Russia, popular mood, and the state of U.S.-Russian relations. And here to walk us through this is, as it turns out, a Yale graduate, a PhD in sociology in 1996. And as you can imagine, since then, he's been doing a lot of other things in Russia in various fields. Let me just read some of the positions that he holds so you get an idea of what Maxim Kiselev has been up to in the past several years. He's at the Higher School of Business at the Moscow State Lomonosov University. He's at the Kingston University MBA program at the Russian Academy for National Economy and Public Affairs. He is also affiliated with the Skolkovo Institute for Science and Technology, and then he actually has a paying job, I understand, right? That's called Vice President for Strategic Business Development at the Noviy company, which I looked up on the web is actually does a lot of programming, games and things like that.
It's still a very big multimedia company and owns the most, I think, I would say, like popular animation studio in St. Petersburg.
There you go. So he does all that, but he also does sociology, and he does understand something about what's going on in Russia. I just had dinner with Maxim in Moscow about 10 days ago. He really has a depth of knowledge, and so we welcome him here. And I think the way we're going to organize this evening is Maxim is going to speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, sort of set the stage. I've got some questions to ask. Well, you're formulating your own questions, and then we'd like to have a lively discussion, and we'll run this to about 5:30, if not longer, depending on interest. So, Maxim.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the introduction, Tom, and this is my not just pleasure and honor, but I'm so touched to be here. Well, Yale, I perceive Yale as truly one of my homes, and I would love to make a tribute to my dearest mentor, Professor Kai Erickson, who is here with us tonight. For me, this is, I'm truly, truly happy. And thank you to Tom and to the organizers at Yale Jackson Institute for Global Affairs for this brilliant opportunity. Now, I certainly prepared a few slides because we are so used now to looking at something at least. And this is for the beginning of the conversation, but also a little bit to somehow facilitate the questions in the future, because depending on what I've done over these past 17 years in Russia, you'd be able to ask, I believe, anything what you would love to know. So what do I do? The first slide truly about me, and besides the things that Tom mentioned, I can say that I also worked for quite remarkable company, which does no longer exist, but that was the best company in Russia. It was called UCAS. Maybe some of you know. I was not in charge for what had happened to UCAS, but me and my wife Valerie, who is here, we actually worked, Valerie worked in the company until the very last day of that company, and I was working by the direct, I would say, request of Mr. Khodorkovsky for another few years in London, sitting the independent think tank to study independently these political, social, and economic realms in Russia of those days. So, oh God. Now about the crisis. It wouldn't be at all a news or a surprise for you that Russia is in quite in-depth economic crisis. And despite, this sort of hoorah propaganda things that you may listen or watch on the Russian TV, the crisis is still going on. Just preparing for our meeting, I looked up the very, very latest, I would say, comments of the biggest economists, Russian economists and international economists. To give you one name, this is academician Aganbegyan, who is probably one of the biggest whiz on the Russian economy. And I took these numbers from his latest interview, which was less than a week ago, on the 28th of September. And if you see, this is not just the state of stagnation, as the Russian government is trying to show, but this is the continuing recession of the Russian economy. And as a matter of fact, the worst recession over the past quite lengthy period of time, because if you look here at the real wage income thing, and this is certainly the thing that is one of the major causes of this stress that people might experience. The real wages, they dropped at least by 10% since the last year. But this is not it about the crisis, because the crisis is being perceived by most of the people as the state of crisis. Well, excuse my tautology. And what do I mean? All of the sociological studies of the recent days, they are showing that more and more people, they would answer this question about crisis, like, do you feel the impact of crisis on yourselves? They would answer yes to this question. And let me tell you that just last year, the same figure was 53%. This year, it's already 76%, which is, in fact, the proof that people are perceiving the economic situation as the crisis. And one of the major causes of this feeling of crisis is certainly the dramatic drop of the Russian currency. Ruble against the world currencies, against dollar, of course. And this graph shows you the two things. One of the things is the change of dollar-ruble equivalency during the past 2 years. If you see, it starts in July of 2014, after the annexation of the Crimea, and it ends in April of 2016 with the drop from 33 rubles per dollar to 65, 66 in April, even 69, I believe, in April of this year. And it is parallel to the oil prices, to the prices for oil, because Russian economy, as you all know, is totally gas and oil dependent. And that's why there is such a strong attachment between currency and oil. And what you see here on the posters that people hold, like save our families from the course of dollar, the exchange rate of dollar. But this is the final thing about the crisis here. We certainly, this year, can, I would say, indicate much greater number of those people who live under poverty levels than it was the years before. And here, well, I took two of the posters, as you see, because there is so much of discussion in the Russian, not only society, but in the Russian expert community as well, whether the crisis reached its bottom. And of course, most of these adequate economists, they would say no, the bottom has not been reached, despite the contradictory talks of those who work for the government, those who work for Kremlin, and who are trying to show that right now recession stopped, and right now this is the period of stagnation, and it will be only better in some future to come. But this is a very remarkable thing, like when Russians feel anxious, they start buying TV sets. And we'll speak about that. As a matter of fact, the propaganda is one of the major causes of the psychological state of the Russian people nowadays. And I'll touch upon that a little bit later. Now, about the elections and how it is connected. Well, these are the formal results of the State Duma election, Russian parliament elections that just happened slightly more than 2 weeks ago, on September 18th, as Tom said. And unfortunately, the results of the elections, they were quite predictable, despite some hopes that they could go otherwise, but they were very much predictable. And the same four parties that were in the former Russian Duma, they stayed in this current Duma. Well, I believe that many of you know that the former Russian Duma was actually the one that took so many, the stupidest and the most anti-human laws ever at all. It was dominated by the governing party called the United Russia, but this parliament will be even more dominated by this party. If you look at the numbers, out of 450 seats in the parliament, 343 seats, they go to the United Russia. These results, as a matter of fact, even exceeded what the experts predicted before the election, because, you know, well, the predictions of some of the political consultants and experts, as I know quite well, they were giving the United Russia, let's say, 44, 45, at the very most 49%. But here you see the number, 54.2% of all votes. The intrigue was between the two parties that go second, meaning the fight between the Communist Party and the Liberal Democrats Party. And they are almost even. As you see here, well, both of them, they have 13.34 and 13.14%, being very close, but still the Communists are a little bit ahead of the Liberal Democrats. And Справедливая Россия, or the Justful Russia, ends the list in the parliament with this 6.22% or 23 seats. Unfortunately, there's hopes that, you know, like intelligentsia, myself, by the way, we had for some change in the parliament, they didn't go through. You may ask me if I voted. Yes, I did vote, because I decided that if I wouldn't do that, well, my voice would certainly go to United Russia, which I didn't want. And so I voted for Yabloko, but as you see, Yabloko did not even reach 2% of the votes. So unfortunate. And I also had some sentimental reason. Well, my friends, some of my friends whom I knew for years now, well, they were balloting for this party, for Yabloko. And now the whole thing. Why such voting? Stress and coping strategies. And here I come to the psychological side of, as a matter of fact, my experience. Well, my dissertation at Yale many years ago under the supervision of Kai Erickson was dedicated to human response to disasters, and specifically that was the case of the post-Chernobyl studies. And I was studying what had happened in the Chernobyl area, in contaminated areas of Belarus, some 7 years after the disaster happened, and how, as a matter of fact, the societal measures undertaken in order to mitigate the consequences of the disaster for those people who live there, how they worked otherwise. And on the contrary, they formed victims' identity, learned helplessness, and some other effects that probably are now familiar as, so to say, the consequences of these most complex radiological disasters. By the way, well, and this is partly for Kai, I didn't drop altogether this line of my research, because right now I'm the member of this international pool of experts for International Atomic Energy Agency, working on the social and psychological consequences of Fukushima. So I traveled a few times to Japan, now studying this area of crises. But just very briefly, before Tom will start asking the questions, why I'm talking here about these non-constructive strategies of coping with stress. Well, certainly most of them are subconscious. And I'm often asked in Russia, like, why? You know, Russia seems to be a very paradoxical country, right? Well, on the one hand, people's lives, they became a lot harder. And they became, in all possible ways of understanding, a lot more miserable than they were before. At the same time, Putin has, as the president of the country, quite enormous rating. This is one of the paradoxes. Why everyone is so or experiences such a great discontent with the government, and still they are voting for the governing party, for the party. By the way, the chairperson of Единая Россия, the United Russia, is the prime minister of the country. Again, this is another paradox. And why all these things might happen, you know, within the same people, within the same population. Here comes one thing that I want somehow to claim as an argument. Well, not changing the real circumstances of their lives, people certainly have to mentally adjust to this environment, to the circumstances they live in. And that's why, well, you know, my background is in clinical psychology. And I worked in the practice of clinical psychology for quite long. So that's why I believe it would be, so to say, accurate to make a parallel between the psychological defenses that people might make in their everyday life relationships with their electoral behavior. That wouldn't be very much of a difference between the two of them. Well, on the one hand, we had kind of very low presence at these elections. Now the question is, like, why the presence was so low? Well, certainly there can be many, many speculations, but one of the kind of straightforward and maybe even a little bit simplistic explanations would be people in Russia over the past couple decades, they were, as a matter of fact, detached from the public politics. Ever since Putin came to power in 2000, he made anything possible as the president of the country to make people in the country, so to say, forgive about being involved, forget about being involved into any sort of political activities. And this strengthened over the past 5 years very, very dramatically, because if you recall the last elections of 2011 that were followed by these mass movements and you know, people bursting out into the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg, Novosibirsk, Yekaterinburg, all big cities in Russia, because they were, as a matter of fact, I would say, like, truly offended. Their votes were just stolen. It didn't happen in these elections, but at that elections it happened. And the Kremlin and the government, they were so much scared by the expression of the mass movements that they even enacted the full number of laws to prevent people from going into the streets and expressing any kind of public protest. Now, a few things here, and we'll turn to the questions. What is a projection? Well, I'm sure that you know psychologically what is a projection. This is one of the most primitive kinds of psychological defense, and especially primitive one, because we can define a few types of projections, but especially primitive one is so-called attributive projection, right? Well, I hit the table, as the child might do. And I say, well, this table is a very bad one. It hits me, right? That's what is called attributive projection. What's going on now within Russian public consciousness? Who is in charge of all problems in nowadays Russia? Give me a wild guess. The Americans. Of course. Well, of course, the Americans, well, they stand behind, this dramatic drop of ruble. Well, the Americans are aggressive. This is another thought that defines projection. Well, Russia is now being very, very aggressive country and very aggressive society. But they would project or attribute this quality to those they want to keep responsible. So the Americans are being shown on the Russian media as, aggressors and so forth. And my observation is that probably this is the worst time in Russian-American relationships ever that I could remember. I remember the Soviet times quite well. But in the Soviet times, I don't remember this sort of anti-Americanistic moods in Russia as we have them now. Now, another projection, by the way, another good illustration to the projection that's happening is with the Ukraine. Well, Russian media will present the Ukraine as a sort of extreme aggressor and very chaotic country. And so they would actually use this scary image of nowadays Ukraine in order to show all the Russians that this is something they don't want, that this is something the government or the Kremlin is trying to prevent people from. Now, what is rationalization? Well, life certainly became much, much, much harder for everyone. But when 2 years ago the annexation of the Crimea happened, there was a sort of euphoria within the publics. They would say, well, Krim nash, like the Crimea is ours. And it was the major, major hit for the national identity to raise. And, well, again, that was associated with Russia raising from the knees and Russia becoming, again, the great country, the superpower, and so forth. And where do I find rationalization here? It's okay that we have to tighten our belts. It's okay that we don't have now these resources and even, our families are not getting as much of services, goods, or something what they need, but Crimea is ours. Now, another thing, identification with aggressor. Well, the well-known Stockholm syndrome. Well, Kremlin is really pushing people and, well, with the help of the state Duma. Well, Duma in Russia certainly is totally subordinate. Well, we don't have really the distinction of powers in the country. Well, Duma, the parliament, would obey anything that Kremlin says. And Kremlin is pushing more and more, harder and harder. And what's happening with the population? They start to identify with the aggressor, exactly in the same way, like Stockholm syndrome, when the victims start to identify with the kidnappers, for instance, or hostages would identify with those who made them hostages. And the final thing is the replacement. Well, here, at the global scale, I would say for Russians, well, Putin succeeded in scaring people away from the politics. His idea was to show, you better deal with your families, you better deal with your everyday life, you better, focus on, let's say, your own homes, your careers, if you wish, and just don't go in for politics. You wouldn't find anything nice there. It's much better to be yourself within your homes, with your families, and replacement happened. People truly are not that much bothering about the politics. That's why, more than half of them didn't show up for the election. Not only because, they thought or were even sure that nothing would depend on their votes, but they just have this attitude. Well, what's going on at the political level is no longer a value. It has no value for people. And it is replaced by value of the family, by value, for instance, well, I'm working in Skolkovo. If you know, Skolkovo is the major in the country, like project to support innovation. So for more than 5 years now, I've been working with these inventors, researchers, scientists, and their replacement is they are very far from voting, from going in for politics, from doing anything in political arena. They are focused on what they do in science, in development, in their research, and that's it. Well, I think I was long enough. Sorry about that. But that was a short introduction to our talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maxim. You've certainly given us a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure we'll have a lively discussion. Let me start with a first question. That has to be the longest talk I've heard on Russia where Putin hasn't figured as the main figure. And so a quick question, actually a two-part question on this. Are the high ratings that we see for President Putin now, about 80%, are they legitimate in your mind, or are they exaggerated in some way? And if they are legitimate, given what you've presented here this evening, how do you explain that high rating?
That's a great question. For the first part of this question, I believe that Putin's rating of 82 is legitimate. Well, as a matter of fact, even such independent pollster companies like Levada Center, they showed exactly the same rating as FCIOM, which actually is, so to say, like Kremlin-independent sociological institution, right? Or FOM, the Foundation for Public Opinion Research. They were all equal in that. 82 is truly like 82. But why is that? And I have my explanation here is, again, purely psychological. While Putin a little bit replicates what happened in the Stalin's time. What do I mean? Well, I often ask my students in Moscow how they can explain that the big country with 155 million population in 30s, how they could tolerate such regime as the Stalin's regime. And most often people would say that was a fear, but only fear cannot keep people obedient. That was love. And why love? Because Stalin, and a little bit in the same way Putin, he actually released people, relieved them from responsibility for their own decisions. So in fact, it corresponds very well with what Erich Fromm wrote, like where we can be or where we can feel the most free ever. In jail. In jail. Because in jail, we don't have this burden of choice, and we don't have to make decisions, and we don't have to bear this responsibility for these decisions. It's a little bit what Putin is trying to achieve. And by the way, Putin actually loves the figure of Stalin, as you know. He gave the full revival to Stalin's image and Stalin's powers and so forth. And people, especially people under stress, they would feel quieter. Subconsciously, they will feel better if they don't have to take responsibility for how they construct their lives, what they do next day, and so forth. That's why I believe that this is the real rating of Mr. Putin. Again, this is kind of paradoxical, right? And the other thing is that Putin, as a matter of fact, is an enforcer and promoter of what we know in psychology as external locus of control. Well, external locus of control, well, the formula of external locus of control is that what's happening in my life does not depend on me. It depends on external forces. as opposed to internal focus. Well, internal focus would say my success and my failures, they depend entirely on me. So Putin, by enforcing this external focus of control and saying that, you know, anyone, the Americans, the European Union, anyone else is in charge of the Russian problems, actually is, again, somehow psychologically is comforting people at subconscious level. That's why they vote. Back to the election. That was not the vote for United Russia. That was vote for Putin. And by the way, even the propaganda of the most active phase of the campaign, which is about, you know, a month and a half before the election, for United Russia was entirely built on the connection between president and the party, despite the fact that the president of the country is not the leader of this party. But they even presented very openly, very straightforwardly, on the media, they presented the party as presidential. I don't know whether I answered, but I tried.
No, that's actually a very good answer. I wanted, in a sense, to follow up on that. And, you know, there's a view quite widespread in the United States that if this economic trouble continues for a longer period, at some point it has to reflect on Putin's own standing. We know in 2011 there was a protest movement, quite intense for at least several weeks after the Duma elections, and probably petered out shortly after the presidential election. What in your mind would have to change in Russia and the psychology of the Russian people in order to lead to a greater protest movement, if not so much out on the streets, certainly one that shows up in the ratings for President Putin?
Yeah. Again, the great question, but here I think I can make 2 points. One point, Russian, I would say, outlook stays very monarchical. And this is, so to say, a proneness, or people are inclined to see just one leader, and somehow to attribute to this one leader, whom we may term as a monarch, all greatest, you know, like human features. In order to lose that, Putin has to do something, I would say, like very, very unpopular. Something that would potentially destruct this almost sacred view of the leader. You know, for Russia that was very traditional, as you know. Well, if we go back to the Soviet times, the first secretaries of the Russian Communist parties, they could be pretty much anyone. The best example would be Mr. Chernenko, one of the last general secretaries, well, the last before Gorbachev, right? Who was unfortunately like totally handicapped. He couldn't even talk, but he could be in the position of the leader of the country because the position is sacred. Something like that is happening to Mr. Putin. He is the leader of the nation, so his position is also somehow sacred. In order to lose that, I think the economic state of the country could be probably 10 times worse than it is now. That people would be totally hungry, totally, you know, deprived from pretty much anything. Well, some sort of, I don't know, like North Korean reality, something like that. And that might probably cause for the protest activity against Mr. Putin. The other consideration into it is that unfortunately, again, Mr. Putin managed to eliminate any other significant political figures from this level of political powers and considerations. So there is no one else who can be even comparable to the figure of Putin right now. And that's why, for instance, the democratic opposition, they could not consolidate because they had no leader. Well, the leaders of these parties, as we saw by the percentages of the votes, they are so far away from Putin that they cannot be even viewed as an alternative. And this is another thing why, Putin ratings will stay high for quite some while, I believe.
Let me press you on that point a bit. We know that 2 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, before the Ukraine crisis, Putin's rating was about 60%.
Yeah, 63.
63, something like that. What was interesting at that time, when I traveled to Moscow, people were prepared to talk about a post-Putin period. You could actually hear names of people that were eventual successors.
Yeah.
Names that mean something in a Russian context probably don't mean a lot to people in the United States. Then we had Crimea, the Ukraine crisis, it jumps up to 60%, and it sort of stayed there through the Ukraine crisis, now the Syrian involvement.
Yeah.
If Putin needs to continue success, is a foreign policy failure, a perceived loss either in Ukraine, Syria, someplace else, something that is sufficient to cause his rating to drop dramatically down to 60% because of the economic conditions, and then create a situation and we begin to hear about potential successors once again?
Well, first, this is just what I think about that. Rating of 60 or 60+% is still the high one. And even if it drops from 82 to 63, as it was in 2012 at Putin's elections, well, still Putin, for the majority of the population, will remain a leader. Second, well, certainly Putin is trying to do anything possible in order to keep this image of, so to say, like successful Russian leader who has more and more of military or civil winnings in various areas. On the one hand, well, the whole thing with Syria was in the same way directed to the international community as it was for the internal Russian community, to show that the Russian military is strong, that the military operation can be, I would say, like modern, up-to-date, and efficient. What is going on in the Ukraine? Putin is actually running what I see, this double-faceted politics, because on the one hand, he certainly is trying to show that Russia has nothing to do with what's going on in military conflict between the Ukraine and the self-proclaimed independent republics, right? On the other hand, he is showing to the leaders of these republics and to the Russians that Russia certainly is helping, not military, but in humanitarian terms, is helping all the ways it can. So, for how long it may last? Unfortunately, I believe for long. I believe for long. And I don't see the way out of the conflict, well, in the immediate future. So that's why my belief is that what might happen at the highest level of Kremlin power depends, again, unfortunately, only on Putin. If he wants to step away, I'm sure that he will prepare a successor, someone who will replace him in this position in order for his future to be safe. But if he doesn't, he'll be the president until he dies. Because nothing prevents him from changing the constitution another time, like it was changed, before the previous elections.
Questions from all of you? We start over here, please, and wait for the microphone, please. And if you just tell us who you are. No, this is for the recording.
Great. Okay.
Be on the record.
That's fantastic. Hey everyone, my name's Peter Cutzen. Just graduated Oxford, based in New York now. Maxim, so great to see you and thank you so much. I had two questions. The first, it's kind of this underlying paradox, right? So if we're seeing such massive apathy on the part of voters, and if Putin has indeed succeeded in pushing them out of the political sphere over the last decade, then why are all these measures so necessary? I mean, why in the last few elections do we see the use of a municipal filter? Why does United Russia? I mean, if assuming that authorities are pushing to have a major landslide victory, why is that necessary? And then the second question. And again, that might speak to an exaggerated perception of threat. I'm not sure. The second question is, if Putin is this apex, and we always assume that were he to leave, things would be disastrous. You mentioned that maybe he could prepare a successor. That's very interesting. To what extent would these kind of psychological measures, the projection, the replacement, external locus of control, are those more kind of an edifice that can carry over, and even in the event of a new person, a new leader, people are still relying on these mechanisms. So it's kind of a stability in that. That's kind of where I was at there. Thank you.
Well, both of the questions are quite in depth. Thank you, Peter. Well, as to the first one, people oftentimes they confuse what Kremlin is doing and what the regional leaders and people at much lower levels of power are doing. And I'm sure that Kremlin did whatever they could in order to at least present the picture of the past elections as being the true ones, the legitimate ones, without falsifications, without this massive use of administrative powers and so forth. But those people, the governors in the regions, the mayors of the cities and many other people who are playing politics, they had to report to Mr. Volodin, who was running the elections on the part of Kremlin. And they could do whatever really was, I would say, if not appropriate, but whatever they could do without being directly accused. Like it happened year by year in the row in Chechnya, for instance. Though Chechnya became much, much better. Well, the first, if you remember, the last elections, they were giving 106% of the voters for United Russia. Well, this year, just 97. That's, they improved. They improved dramatically. And, this is to your question, why it was applied. It's not because Kremlin tried to do that, but because Kremlin could not control what people would be doing really in some of the remote places. And if you look at Moscow, St. Petersburg, or Novosibirsk, or Yekaterinburg, well, certainly the electoral picture there would be totally, totally different. Well, Yabloko, for instance, in Moscow, they got almost 10% of the votes. But, well, it didn't happen at the federal level, of course, but, I'm saying is that the situation was different. Now, to your second question, whether, so to say, this sort of psychological defenses or coping with stress strategies will remain if the successor comes to place. Most probably, yes. They will stay the same. By the way, some rumors of the possible successors, they have been floating around for quite some while. And you remember probably like a couple years ago when Putin disappeared for 2 weeks, there were a lot of speculations like what had happened, that this is the extra Putin, not the real one, the duplicate, and so forth. The only figure that might be at this point, I believe, like seriously considered to be a successor, is Mr. Shoigu. His rating is quite enormous because he was, as you remember, before becoming the Minister for Defense, he was the Minister for Emergencies, and he was shown as, first of all, founding and running this ministry that helped so many people in the country. And his image is incomparable, I would say, with any of the party leaders, with any of the ministers. But I'm sure that if it ever happens, well, the image of the president would be kept very close to what Putin has now as the president. And that's why the same strategies would remain in place. Did I answer?
Right here, please.
Thank you.
I'm Volodymyr Kulik. I'm a visiting professor here at Macmillan. I'm from Ukraine, so have a particular interest in what you are saying. And my first question is, as I compare your mechanisms and the results of supposed working of this mechanism in Russia and Ukraine, I wonder, not only in Ukraine, but in other countries, I wonder what's so special about Russia. Certainly, these mechanisms are at work in many countries. At least the rulers always want them to be at work and to be successful. Why is Russia so special in being its elites being successful in implementing this mechanism, making them work? Why is it so different even from other post-Soviet countries? Looking at my country, of course, always the government, the president want the citizens to share responsibility without actually sharing in benefits. But it doesn't work. The population just doesn't buy it. Why the Russians do buy it? If you look at the United States, always, of course, it's like we were attacked, but then just us became richer, and you maybe have to wait for your opportunity to become richer, and so on. So what's so special about Russia? And second, I wonder if you have any special insight into the particular situation in Crimea with regard to all of this. How do the Crimeans cope with the threats of not exactly getting what they hoped for? Is there any special dimension to the Crimeans' stress and coping with the stress? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Two of these questions, they may take another couple hours, right, to answer. Yeah. Yes, I'll try to be as short as I can. What is so special about Russia? Of course, I can answer you with Churchill's words, that you can never, understand Russia with your intellect. Умом Россию не понять. But certainly I wouldn't do that, and I would say that those people who did not apply or who didn't want to apply these sort of strategies, they remain the minority, and either they left the country or they stay in the country and do these political activities as we see even in the past elections, right? Trying to do something, but probably it will take many, many years for them to reach some results. That's it. While the majority of the population, they feel safer, they feel more comfortable, psychologically sound, if they apply those strategies and don't do anything else. And this is nothing special, as I agree with you. Well, in many countries, people, under the circumstances, might try to be doing the same. However, well, I don't know the Ukraine that well, and the last time I was in the Ukraine was some 5 years ago, so much before all of the events, right? But Ukraine was fortunate to give this feeling and sense of democracy that Russia hasn't had. Well, only within Yeltsin's time, for a short period of time, because Yeltsin believed the free democratic elections. And so there was, for a very short time, but there was something like that, but never to the extent that Ukraine has. So that's why I believe it doesn't work for the Ukrainians now. Because, by the way, one time when I was in Kiev, there were these mayor's elections in Kiev, I think 2008, as far as I remember, right? So at some point, well, some of the elections for mayor of the city. And there were 69 candidates. Can you imagine like 69 candidates for the mayor of Moscow or governor of St. Petersburg? So the Ukraine got the sense of pluralism and pluralistic politics and was never deprived from the public politics in the same way as Russia was. I don't know, I believe that this is not the full answer to your questions, but partly it explains why Russians, or the Russians, they are eating what is being given from Kremlin. Now about the Crimea. We principally didn't go to Crimea over these years. You know, we never tried and didn't want to, despite the fact that the last time we were in Crimea in 2011, while I was running some training for the Russian bank and Russian financial company there that belonged to Mr. Lebedev, if you know Alexander Lebedev, one of the personalities who contributed and invested a lot into Crimea. And we loved the area. Well, I was there many times when I was still a child, but we decided not to go to the annexed territory. However, well, what we know not only from the newspapers or the open press and so forth, but from some of the people who are from the Crimea. You are absolutely right saying that the expectations were not met. And the level of discontent among the Crimean population is very, very high. And some hardships in their lives that they experience are probably even worse than they had under the Ukraine. What makes them to support Putin? Well, it comes, I believe, from the current government of the Crimea, because they certainly were put in places in their positions by Kremlin, with the help of Kremlin, so they owe to Putin and to Kremlin. And that's why they try to do anything possible in order to maintain a certain level of loyalty and certain level of, I would say, acceptance of the mainland Russian politics. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Lena. I'm also from Ukraine. I teach international relations at University of New Haven. I have a question about sort of in the grand scheme of things. Patty Ashton once talked about how in today's day and age, it's not what a country can do that matters, it's what it can do with others. In terms of future alliances, in this sort of world of where countries are aligning based on their strategic interests and importance, there's prediction that that no one country, no matter how strong it is, can survive on its own now, economically, politically, culturally. And Maria Mandras spoke at Columbia recently, and she talked about how eventually Russia belongs in Europe, culturally, historically, because no matter how much Putin is now supporting Assad's regime and Iran, it's not where Russia belongs, right? Any superpower requires an alliance of sorts. So she predicted that eventually Russia is going to belong in Europe because it has nowhere else to belong. It needs to strive to to have that membership. And as Tim Snyder said, Europe is only as good as it is desirable. Do you think that Russians desire European values as much as Ukrainians do right now? Do you think that that is, in fact, the future of Russia's global alliance with Europe?
Well, it's a very good question as well. Russians, this is my observation of the past few years, they are extremely susceptible to propaganda. as a matter of fact, they are vulnerable in a lot stronger way that I could think initially. And yes, Europe is shown as a natural, so to say, choice for the alliances for Russia, but Europe is also largely criticized in propaganda, in the Russian media, for many things, and it is not shown as, you know, like the friend of nowadays, but it is rather shown as the land full of problems. Well, especially, you know, now connected with the immigrant situation in Europe, with, you know, all of these economic issues that many of the European countries has, like Greece, for instance, well, with the default and all the other signs of the economic crisis. So I agree that for Russia it would be much more natural to look at Europe as potential alliance. But over the past 2 years or 3 years, very strongly, Russia is looking east, and especially is looking China. And, you know, it is very strange because, you know, I would say, I'm not a political scientist, but any reasonable political analyst would say China has no alliances with anyone. China will not make any alliance with any country in the world because this is China, what Russia is hoping for. But still, Russia kind of consistently, and especially with the era of sanctions, and especially with this tension between Russia and the United States, is now claiming China as a friend. And you know, like, it reminds a little bit of like post-war or 50s of the past century. Stalin and Mao, братья навек, like brothers forever, right? Which is strange, but that's how it looks like now. Another country that comes to stage, surprise, surprise, is Iran. And Russia is now making lots of, and this showing, lots of, you know, various cooperation memorandums with Iran. Well, first of all, economic ones. But right now, well, it's turning somehow into the political acceptance of what's going on in Iran. And, you know, Iran is becoming one of the potential friends, alliances. And certainly Russia, well, if we look what's going on with the Middle East, well, partly the military operation of Russians in Syria, well, they were partly connected to, I believe, Kremlin's desire to stay or to have some influence in the region and to keep this influence in the region. Despite all of these, you know, like economic burdens and many other things associated with war, because this is the real war. So at the same time, whenever there are any signs of, I would say, like European sympathy to Russia, well, they are immediately exaggerated in the media. Well, once we have these expressions of people diplomacy and so forth, that they are fine, but they certainly would be shown as the signs that Europe is dreaming of getting back to friendship with Russia. And Russia now is such a power, it's such a great state, that it would think twice before, you know, like agreeing to these intentions.
Can I follow up on that? You gave an answer that's at the high political level, and I think you were right. What about at the popular level? Have popular attitudes towards Americans changed? Have popular attitudes towards Chinese changed? Have popular attitudes towards Iranians or anyone else changed because of this political decision to press anti-Americanism and turn to the East? I mean, I would imagine that if you go out to the Russian Far East, they're still concerned about 1 million Chinese across the border coming in and taking over the land, whether it's correct or not. Has that popular attitude changed because of the political change in Moscow?
Well, this is very complex question, but I can share my observations with you on that. At the level of people's attitude, there is certainly a very clear-cut distinction between, so to say, attitude towards politicians. I was present at few focus groups that Valerie was running, like working with the voters before these elections. And I was behind the glass, if you know the focus groups, I was behind the glass. To tell you the truth, I was shocked myself just listening to some of the sayings of the focus group participants about America being blamed for the Russian problems. That people would believe quite sincerely that Russian ruble was dropped by the American Central Bank. They would call it this way, American Central Bank, and so forth. But as I said before, well, Russian might is kind of paradoxical. Well, it would never ever affect people being in love with American culture, American movies, American lifestyle, America as a concept, and American dream, and so forth. And at the levels of, like people-to-people relationships, I think they remain quite all right as they were before. And I do not take into consideration the people of our circle. Well, we are very frequent guests to Spasa House in Moscow. Well, lots of people from the American embassy, they were to our house. And Peter once worked in the American embassy as well in the former times. But I mean, like people that are doing something else, that are at different levels of, I would say, like social construction, and those people whom we call like simple people, or simple populations. I never really observed, this popular aggression or popular, I would say, unacceptance of the Americans or Europeans. And despite the fact that due to the economic hardships, the Russians are now traveling less, especially to Europe or to the United States. But it still remains as a very desirable destination for travels, right? Now, the other side of the story, whether the Russians love the Chinese. Well, here the answer rather would be no. Quite on the contrary. Despite the fact that China is declared to be friend number one, but I didn't see many people who would really express some sort of, affection towards the Chinese. Why? Well, first of all, China is a lot more uncertain for the Russians, unknown to the Russians. They can hardly understand, this sort of Eastern outlook, Eastern minds, and so forth. This is for one thing. For another thing, going back to the far east of Russia, well, there the situation with, so to say, like peaceful annexation is very tough. Because if you look at the Amur River, which is the border, on the Russian side of the Amur River, you have about 8.5 million population, while on the Chinese side, you have about 400 million, roughly, And so that means that inevitably Russian economy on the Russian side, sooner or later, would become totally dependent on the Chinese. Sometimes on the Russian media you can see this sort of reports about mixed families in this area, and about mixed businesses and working together and so forth. So it is not presented by the media as something scary or as something to be afraid of. my understanding is that at the popular level, the things are not so bad as at the political one.
Other questions? Way in the back?
A couple of questions. One is whether in all these political attitudes you can discern any kind of difference between the generations in their attitudes. And the second is unrelated to that. It's whether you think there is any kind of significant role played by the church in kind of organizing and creating psychological attitudes in social and political spheres.
Okay, thank you. Both questions are great. Well, first about the generations. Well, the generations theory is becoming more known and more popular even within, like political considerations. And what I can say, I was asked this question in Moscow a few times about Generation Y that we have as the young people, and what is their, I would say, like general outlook and how they think, how they perceive the reality. And I think it would be true to say that the younger generation is the furthest one from politics as all the previous ones. The younger people, they do not vote, they are not interested, they see no value in, I would say, like political activities and so forth. And certainly it is a noticeable difference between Generation Y and Generation X. Well, Generation X is from 1964 to 1984, year of birth, right? Those people who are in their mid-ages now. These people, they are a lot more critical. By the way, mainly they were those people who were in Bolotnaya in 2011. Because, Bolotnaya was mainly associated with so-called active class. Active class meaning, we don't have strict definitions for the middle class in Russia, but closer to middle class, or those people who have good education, good jobs, and good income associated with these good jobs.
What would you call creative class?
Creative class or active class, both terms were applied. Creative class, active class, and so forth. Well, I can share with you some of the observations of my students in the Moscow State University or in Skolkovo. Well, let me tell you, these young people, they are focused on their private lives. Most of them, they do not associate their future with the future of the country. So they are rather trying to prepare themselves for leaving the country. No matter how sad it might sound, but this is true. That's, a few years ago, when was that, when we made the special study on yappies? Yeah, something like that, some 10 years ago. Even some 10 years ago, we made a study on yappies. And we took Moscow, and we took the most depressed at that time, one of the most depressed cities, Ulyanovsk. Well, in mid-Volga region. And even then, the study showed that those people educated, well, with good potential, especially with knowledge of one or two foreign languages, they would prefer to find themselves somewhere else, not in Russia, because they are looking for better conditions for them, for their families, and as a matter of fact, better opportunities to realize themselves. Well, the same is going on with the younger generation now of what I see. By the way, not that long ago, I was quoted by Bloomberg. Well, I gave an interview to Bloomberg, and the interview was quite big, but only one phrase remained from this interview. like it often happens, right? Maxim Kiselev, the former top official of Skolkovo, said that Skolkovo has become the incubator for immigrants. So because truly, I know tens of companies. Well, when I joined Skolkovo, there were 90 companies, like participants of this project. Right now, it's about 1,500. But I know tens and tens of companies, they left the country already. Despite the fact that Skolkovo was modeled, was founded in order to keep people inside. Now, could you remind me the second question?
Russian Orthodox Church.
The church. Yes, thank you. The church. Well, I see the two things happening in association with the church. One thing, that church becoming more and more close to the state. And despite the fact that Russia remains, constitutionally, remains the civil state, while church is interfering political realms more and more actively lately. What is being actually shown by the media and being presented to the people as, so to say, one of the ongoing modern processes. The other thing, whether it has much of an impact on people, well, frankly, I doubt it. This is something I do not see. Because, despite the fact that it became sort of fashionable to be back to church, back to faith in nowadays Russia, most of the people, they don't really take that in depth. They don't take that very sincerely. They just keep some ritual, but nothing more. To that end, church is not really affecting their minds. Well, at least this is what I know.
I think we have time for one more question, and way in the back.
Just wondering, we have all of these reasons that the voters are making the decisions that they are, and we have some identification there. So, given that you mentioned that the church is also moving closer to the state, is there any mechanism which is dealing with what is wrong with the voting mechanism right now? In terms of, if I understand that voters are being convinced to leave public politics and focus on the state, on their own homes and families, is there some mechanism by which voters can again be convinced to look at and engage with politics and identify that identifying with the aggressor is wrong, in terms of redressing what is happening now?
Well, certainly there are some mechanisms, but unfortunately they're just very weak at the moment, which we clearly see on the results of the elections. Well, the oppositionary parties, these are those mechanisms. They try to at least, enlighten people of what is right or wrong. Well, we have such ventures as Navalny, anti-corruption foundation, while showing the real numbers of corruption in the country and so forth. But let me tell you, it does not reach too many. It still remains very, very narrow. And that's why I'm saying that these mechanisms, they are kind of weak, right? In order to expand them, well, probably they have to have, on the one hand, more of a public support, which is not yet in place. On the other hand, they have to be somehow sponsored because, without the money, it just wouldn't run. The saddest thing happened to Levada Center, which was declared a foreign agent. Just maybe a few days after Levada Center showed kind of a low support for United Russia in August, right? Well, their study showed that there was 31% of support in August. And just in a few days after, they were declared a foreign agent, which meant, in fact, I would say almost the elimination of this institution because they wouldn't have money to survive. right? Well, and by the way, the Kremlin's administration, they're kind of sensitive to these mechanisms. And if they see that somewhere something appeared, they might deliberately take an effort to destroy it. That's why I'm saying that over, his years of power, well, Putin succeeded quite a bit in order to ruining the institutions of civil society. Well, this is the problem, that these institutions, they were never built, in fact, or never enforced, unfortunately.
Okay, on that optimistic note.
Well, no, well, we certainly are optimistic, as you say.
Well, we know it can get worse. Right.
Yeah.
No, thank you very much, Maxim, for a very
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Thank you.